Good evening, and welcome to the 12th chapter of the One Book, One Minnesota statewide book club, featuring Sharks in the Time of Saviors by Kaui Strong Washburn. The One Book, One Minnesota program is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book and sponsored by Blaze Credit Union. I'm Elaine Hopkins, Director of Programs and Services for the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. As such, we present programming that reaches all corners of our state and promotes reading, libraries, and our state's literary legacy. We acknowledge and value the traditions of storytelling embedded in our state's land by Minnesota's original stewards of story, the Dakota, Ojibwe, and many other tribal nations that call this place home. We at the Friends honor the knowledge of place, community, and culture rooted in these living stories as we work to lift up the voices of storytellers across our state. Tonight's programming has live captioning provided by Christy Arntzen of Veritext Captioning, and we're thrilled to welcome attendees from all over the state. Thank you all for choosing to spend your time with us this evening. Now, I'm honored to introduce our featured guests. Kaui Strong Washburn was born and raised on the Hamakua coast of the Big Island of Hawaii. His first novel, Sharks in the Time of Saviors, won the 2021 Penn Hemingway Award for Debut Novel and the 2021 Minnesota Book Award. It was also longlisted for the 2020 Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and was a finalist for the 2021 Penn Gene Stein Book Award. Former U.S. President Barack Obama chose it as a favorite novel of 2020, and it was selected as a notable or best book of the year by over a dozen publications, including the New York Times and Boston Globe. It has been translated into 8 languages and counting. Kaui is joined in conversation by V.V. Ganeshan, the author of the novels Brotherless Night, a New York Times Editor's Choice and Minnesota Book Award finalist, and Love Marriage, which was longlisted for the Women's Prize and named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post. Her work has appeared in Granta, the New York Times, and the Best American Non-Required Reading, among others. She teaches in the MFA program at the University of Minnesota and co-hosts the Fiction Nonfiction podcast on Literary Hub, which is about the intersection of literature and the news. These authors will be happy to answer questions from the audience after their conversation, so please feel free to put those in the chat. Welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It's a huge pleasure to be here with Kaui, whose work I admire so much and have had a chance to chat with you before about the book, and I'm looking forward to talking about it more with this, I know, very enthusiastic audience that has been engaging with the book as part of this terrific program. So just want to echo the thanks for all of you being here tonight. And Kaui, it's great to see you. How are you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library and having this One Book, One Minnesota program as a whole, really awesome. I love public libraries. I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. I was working right up until we came online for this. For those that don't know, like I have another job, a totally different job that I do during the day. I'm a software engineer, and so I write on the side, and I've got 2 young children, so I was helping them cook dinner and working right up until we did this. But I'm good, and I just wanted to again thank the Friends of the St. Paul Public Libraries and libraries as a whole, because they were what I went to when I was a kid. I lived in a place that I would have considered, a book desert without the public library, really small public library branch in Honokaa. And when I wrote this book, when I wrote Sharks in the Time of Saviors, I wrote large sections of it in public libraries throughout the cities I was living in. I lived in DC for a while and wrote parts of it in that public library. I was living in California for part of the time I was writing it, and I wrote parts of it in public libraries there. So my connection to libraries is strong, and then this book also benefited from having these wonderful public spaces that our public libraries are. So yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. And as we mentioned earlier, if you have not read Brotherless Night, and we're going to talk about it some tonight as well, this book is fantastic. So hopefully we get a chance to talk about both of these books in the ways that I feel like have very similar themes and approach a lot of the same material. So
thank you. And so, I guess I should also mention, as Elaine said, I'm VV Ganeshan, but a lot of people who know me call me Sugi, which Kaui probably will. So so I thought actually it's great that you started off talking a little bit about all the places that you wrote the book from. I wondered if, of course, the book centers a modern Hawaiian family affected in different ways by their relationships to fate and free will and community and belief. And in an earlier exchange with me, you phrased this as the sacred and the realist. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about growing up in Hawaii and your own experiences kind of in those spaces, the sacred and the realist, and how those made their way into the book.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I wanted to explore was I'm so grateful and fortunate to have grown up in the islands because they really do feel, I think anybody that's visited them and anybody that's spent time living there for an extended period of time would agree that there's just something about the place where you can feel the natural world coming alive in very special ways. And so one of the things that I was hoping to try and achieve in this novel was to kind of express that feeling and the ways in which it can be transcendent when you have these moments and experience some of the natural beauty of the place, the way that it can have these really profound effects on you and feel transcendent. And to do that in a way that also helps people understand the larger heritage and rich cultural background that informs those spaces, because I think a lot of people might only be familiar with the islands through stories that don't necessarily center that part of the islands and those sorts of things. So I really wanted to get at that part, and that's what I think of when I think of the sacred. Although, even beyond that, the islands themselves, I also wanted to touch on the general feeling of transcendence, because there are even some parts of the book where, for instance, Kaui, who's one of the siblings, is doing things like rock climbing, and she's having these moments of relationships with people that felt like they transcended boundaries. I think there's even one part where she talks about she's sharing a bowl with somebody that she has this complicated, intimate relationship with, and they pass the bowl back and forth and they share the spoon, and she says that it feels like she was praying when she's she takes this bite of the food with the same spoon that she shared with her lover, friend, and things like that. And so there were other issues of the sacred in which I tried to bring that out, the sort of relationships we can have with other people that feel sacred, feel like they transcend boundaries. So those are all the things I was thinking of from the perspective of sacred. And the realist part, I think, goes to the parts that a lot of people are familiar with, or for a lot of people when they read this were very obvious themes to them, which are those related to things like, the friction between the socioeconomic reality of being a part of the United States, a colonized part of the United States, and how that can affect inequality and racial injustice, and just the day-to-day realities of trying to survive in America when you are not in a class that feels stable, right? If you're in any of the lower classes, or what we refer to sometimes as blue collar or working classes, the day-to-day realities of surviving in this country are very stark and very challenging. And so that was one of the other things that I think on the realist side is part of what I was trying to work with in the novel.
It is really incredible the way that physical space connects to the transitions between, or sometimes the coexistence of the sacred and the realist in the book. Are there particular spaces in Hawaii where when you were little, like you would go to experience the transcendence that you're talking about?
Yeah, there were so many. It was, and it was different when I was a kid. So I'm 44 years old now. I might as well just out myself as far as my age, but I'm 44 years old. And so when I was growing up, the islands were different than they were now. They were largely, I would say, still off the like quote unquote radar of the sort of mass tourism that exists now. So when I go home now, I'm surprised to see how many people there are on the Big Island where I grew up. And there are like stoplights where there didn't used to be stoplights, and all of this traffic and infrastructure that didn't exist. And so there were places that I was able to visit that I don't think you can go anymore. Like there were hikes I took on some mountain areas that have since, I think, been fenced off and made prohibited spaces. The valley that is in the book, right, Waipio Valley, it has become, there's such a large influx of tourists that they've basically closed down access to the valley to anybody but people that actually live down there. But I got to actually spend lots of time there as a kid. Like we could go down to the valley floor, and like you could hitchhike down or take a truck down or whatever and get to the valley floor and go out to the beach that was out there. So there are places like the valley, like I hiked up the other side of the valley that Dean spent some time in, right? When he's looking for Nainoa later on in the book, he travels through Waipio Valley and passes over into Waimanu Valley. And those are places that I spent time hiking. Beaches on the west side. I don't think there are any scenes in the novel with any of that stuff, but there are some beaches on the west side that I got to spend a lot of time in. growing up, doing a lot of surfing and stuff like that. So yeah, there's a ton of spaces. It's a beautiful place, a fantastic place.
So you're of course mentioning all these fabulous characters who we love, and the book gets its title from an early scene in which Nainoa, who in the book is generally referred to as Noah, his parents and his siblings fear that sharks are going to attack him, and instead they save him from drowning, and that incident becomes kind of mythologized in the community, kind of like right at the intersection of what we were talking about before, the sacred and the realist, and alters the family's lives, and kind of makes Noah into a little bit of like a community star in a way that is helpful to the family in maybe presenting them with opportunities to move out of the working class that we were referring to before, the difficulties of poverty, but also like puts real strain on their relationships. That scene, which of course is early in the book, is kind of the whole, like so much of the book's premise is resting on that scene. Can you tell us a little bit about how did you write that scene?
Yeah.
How did you end up with that? It's wild. It's a great scene.
Thanks. I wish this is one of the few times where it feels like I cannot explain, like this whole book came about because that image showed up in my head, or at least the image of a child in the water drowning and being saved by sharks. I don't know where it came from. And the book took me 10 years to write, and it came out in 2020. So sometime in 2008, 2009, 2000, somewhere in there, that image showed up in my head. And I was just getting started as a writer at that time, as far as like I think I had finished a novel that was a failed novel that I had shelved. I was working on some short stories, and that image just showed up. I can't exactly remember where it showed up. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And all right, I'm just going to go on with my life and these other things I'm working on. But it kept showing up. It showed up a few times. I would be sitting on the bus spacing out, or I'd be washing dishes, and it would come back. And so I started to ask questions like, all right, if there's a kid drowning in the water, like the first thing I thought of was like, where's their family? Why is this happening? And as I started asking questions, because the image kept coming back, then I started to ask questions about a family. And that led me to think about the dynamics of a family in a situation in which this would happen. And then all these things just started pouring out of me as I was working on it, because I think for a long time I had been dealing with a lot of the issues of having like been born and raised in the islands and then moved to the continental United States as an adult, and just feeling all of this weird disconnection and dislocation with the continental United States. Like I just never really felt grounded the way I did in the islands. And so I think all of those things started pouring in, as well as I was starting to try and ask questions about that initial image. And so then I just sat down and started the novel. And I think I more or less started with that scene. I think that opening scene, well, no, yeah, I think that part is where I started. And then I moved back a little bit farther in time to kind of ask questions. As I was asking questions about Nainoa, the child, and I started to move back. But yeah, that initial scene, it just showed up in my head. And just for anybody that's listening, if you're a writer or have any interest in writing, most of it is not magic. Just so you know that I do not suggest that your writing can only happen if something magic happens. Most of it is just work like anything else. But in that particular moment, yeah, that's where that image came from. I don't know where. So.
It's an incredible image. And of course the title has this connection to that scene. But I think it also has this incredible resonance beyond that, right? With the question of who we think saviors are, and also what presents menace or appears to present menace, and maybe isn't exactly what it seems. What do you think makes a good title? I always love asking other writers this. And how did you get to this one?
Yeah.
And how do you see it connecting to other parts of the story?
Yeah, I wish I had I feel like this is when you ask a band where they got their name and they like lie about where they got it from. I guess like one of the most famous examples I know of that was like Pearl Jam. I think they made up the story about where they got their name from or something, because they had to get a cool story for it. And it was probably just, they saw two words and put them together. So Sharks in the Time of Saviors, man, it's been such a long time since I did this. All I can remember is that I needed to slap a title on it before I sent it out. And I knew that largely that there were themes in it related to, I knew that as I'd gone through a few rounds of revisions, that the idea of like, being saved and salvation, and the idea of, in the case of Nainoa, him personifying this idea of salvation for their family was a central theme. And so I was like, okay, so saviors, it's got something to do with saviors. And I was like, but I got to get like a shark in there somehow, right? Because that's like the whole thing. And so I ended up just sort of putting something together that worked with those two things. I just slapped the name on it and sent it. And then when I was talking to my editor later, like on multiple meetings, we have these meetings about the book, and I was like, if anybody, and this was happening through emails, we have these like, meeting calls and everything. And I was like, if anybody has a better idea for a title for this book, I am all for it. And nobody ever said anything. Like the question, I would say that and it would just, there'd be silence. Nobody would say anything. So the title was largely me just sort of grasping at straws and knowing there were a couple of things thematically that I was working with, and that I wanted to kind of get sharks in there, and so I just sort of put those things together, and just, I don't know. And people seem to really love the title. I've never really
title.
gotten quite comfortable with it. I've always been like, I'm sure there's a better title out there somewhere for this book. So
That's really funny. So wait,
I actually want to rewind a second and ask you the same question you had asked me just a little bit earlier. Do you find when you're writing that do you work from, when you start your writing, does it come from scenes? Does it come from themes that you want to work with? How do you arrive at kind of the inciting incident for books or things like that? I don't know if you want to speak specifically to Brotherless Night and what might have been the inciting concept for that. But I always love to hear what other writers use as kind of their way into the larger material they work on.
That's it's an interesting question, because to think about when you work on a book for so long, I, like you, worked on it for a very long time.
Yeah.
What did I do first? I think I did a lot of research, and so some of the early parts of Brotherless Night arose from just sort of like surfing history and finding things that were kind of incomplete or would have seemed to me like less likely, like the strangest, the most marginal aspects of history, and then kind of following those things from there. So at least in the case of this book, but sometimes it's a voice and that says a sentence, and your book is so rich with voices. And so I think, like, it's funny, I think that there's lots of aspects of craft that I work on very consciously, but I think for me, voice is one of those things where I'm like, hello, subconscious, how will you help me today? And so I a little bit I have no idea how that happens. But they seem to be strong voices that have opinions on that have strong opinions, which is helpful. And your characters also have these amazing, strong voices and opinions. And one of the things I admire so much about the book is that you inhabit so many different voices. And so completely and immersively. Brotherless Night, for those who, just as a point of contrast, is all in it's in one voice, and I like the subtle move up.
So product placement. No, but for everybody that's watching this, I really, really highly recommend this book, and we'll talk about it more tonight. But please go ahead.
Thank you. But yeah, like I to switch voices to sound different. Right. And of course they're all you, and they're none of them you. And I have my favorites among them. I'm sure our audience does too. Can you take us a little bit through the different members of the family and writing and discovering not only the child in the water being saved by the sharks, but also his siblings, Dean, who you mentioned, Kaui, their parents, all of them, like, just really full-throated voices.
Yeah, that was a huge challenge with this book, and probably part of what made it take so long. There was I was giving a book talk on it. It was a while ago. I was at a university, and one of the students just straight up asked, how come it took you so long to write this book?
I get that.
Yeah, I was like, great. I appreciate the implication there. But anyway, but one of the things that made it such a struggle was trying to build these different voices. Because for me, I know that as a reader, I think one of the things that I do as a writer, as a writer, you'll get a lot of advice from different people. And if you're doing research and you're trying to become a writer, a lot of people will talk about, figure out who your audience is and write for your audience and all those sorts of things. And I know you've spoken as well reading through the interviews that were part of your book, you had talked a little bit about this idea of the audience and how it's like a kind of a strange and complicated thing to try and deal with this issue of audience that you're writing for. And so for me, I think more than anything, And at the time, I had no idea what was going to happen with this book, but I was writing it. And I think I just sort of settled on writing for myself. I'm just going to write a book that I would love to read. And one of the things that I respond to really strongly as a reader is voice. And I love first person perspective stories and novels, because I love getting swept up. It's one of the parts of writing and reading that is like very specific to the art form. You cannot get it from any other form of storytelling, whether it's, film or theater or, I guess those are the ones I'm thinking of off the top of my head. But those forms of storytelling, you can never get that sort of mind meld, or the thing where you sort of experience the world directly through another person's consciousness. And reading is the one experience, I think, where you can do that, and you do it often through the first person. And I love that as a reader, because I feel like when I get done with books that are written in the first person perspective, especially if the voice is distinct, it like stays with me later on. I can feel a little bit of that consciousness hang around for a while. And so I really wanted to do that with this book. And so I worked really hard on just trying to develop these voices that were as far from my own as possible, like not the way that I would speak, and things like that. And also to make them distinct among the group, and as part of who they were and who they were becoming, also have that influence who their voices were, right? And so Dean is a brother who, then all of the siblings end up having these different things they're really good at, right? Nainoa is this one that has that moment where he's saved from drowning by sharks. He ends up developing these like abilities that he doesn't entirely understand, where he's able to sort of commune with the natural world, and he can do things like he ends up helping to like repair people's bodies and things like that. And so he is somebody who kind of is catapulted into this upper echelon space, where he ends up getting into a prestigious preparatory academy in the islands and things like that. And so his voice is very, I would say, like, yeah, it's just got a lot of complex vocabulary in it. It's a little bit lyrical because he's living in this communal space with this other world. Whereas Dean is kind of down in like the realist side of things, if we look at that sacred to realist contrast again, right? And he's a basketball player. He doesn't get into any of these good schools. He's got a lot of resentment that he carries. And he also considers himself a very practical person that understands the way the world works. This is his opinion of himself. He's like, I understand the way the world works. I think that what we need more than anything is money. I'm sick of being broke. I'm going to get us money however we need to get it. And so his voice reflects that. And it also reflects what I would have considered a much more like a local style perspective and voice, from Hawaii. So he uses a lot more of pidgin, which is, that's what we call the patois in the islands is pidgin. And so then, Kaui kind of splits the difference, because she's also really intelligent. She's overlooked. She has to work twice as hard for half as much of the recognition that Nainoa and Dean both get, and she knows it, and so she resents that. And so her voice, I think, also, works with that dynamic, and it informs how her language builds. And for the parents, for them, I mostly, again, just tried to reach back into my observations of what it was like growing up in the islands. Like, I grew up in Honokaa. It's a small town. It was a sugarcane plantation town that had a high number of agricultural jobs, but those jobs are being shed over the course of the time that I was growing up. And then in 1994, the sugarcane plantation that a lot of the people in the community were working at shut down for good. And so a lot of those jobs were lost. And so a lot of the people around me that in school, my baseball coaches, people that worked in all these different spaces and places that I lived in growing up, those are people whose lives I observed and tried to use to inform Augie and Malia, who are the parents of the kids. So there's a lot of work. It's awful.
It was, I mean, it is like, I do think, I teach creative writing at the University of Minnesota, and I sat in many workshops as a student, and it is the thing that happens where someone, brings in a manuscript or is working on a story that has a bunch of different first person voices, and someone says, these all sound a little bit the same. And maybe that criticism holds water, maybe it doesn't, but it's the thing that gets sort of, that gets people worried, and these are so distinctive. They talk to and about each other, and to see that as a reader, it's very satisfying. I think it's like, for a reader to feel smart by getting to see all of these perspectives and knowing all of them when each of them only knows their own, is a really cool is a really cool feeling. And there's a passage in the book that we were talking about earlier, from Dean's point of view, and I think it's 2004 in Spokane. And I wonder, it sort of gets at like the sacred and the realist, and also sibling relationships. And I wonder if you would read from that for us.
Yeah, yeah, I will. Dean, by the way, is the hardest voice for me to read. It's full on Pidgin, and so it's hard to sometimes get it right. Yeah, so I'll read from that in the paperback, or at least in the one that I have. It's in like pages 79 and a little bit on. I'll go through just a couple of pages of this. So for those of you that, I think at this point, everybody who's here has probably read most of it, or if they haven't, then they've probably at least gotten through this part. I don't know, maybe you put it down after 20 pages and you thought it was boring. I don't know, but Dean is a brother that ends up being very good at basketball, very, very good. And so he gets into a school in Spokane, in Washington, on the basketball team with a full ride scholarship. And so this part is when he first arrives there. And so this is his moment to kind of step out from under the shadow of Nainoa that he's been in this whole time, because back in Hawaii, living with Nainoa, both he and Kaui were massively overshadowed, because this this miracle happens where Nainoa is saved from drowning by sharks. He gets all this attention within the community. He develops these abilities. He's really smart. And so he just completely overshadows the two siblings. But Dean is in the background nursing this resentment, and he finally gets to this university in Spokane on a full ride basketball scholarship. And this is the section where he first shows up. He also swears more than other people. I'm going to really quickly caveat this. So he swears a lot more than other people. I'm going to try really hard to censor all the swearing. There are parts of his personality that are super rough, right? So he's like misogynistic. He's homophobic at different times. Those are not views or opinions I personally hold. This is a character, right? So he has these opinions, and these are his ways of being. I don't endorse them or support them. That's just who this character is as a real character. So I'll read from that section now. This is Dean in 2004 in Spokane. Way I figure, before the first Hawaiians became Hawaiians, it was them back in Fiji or Tonga or wherever, and they had too many wars with too many kings, and some of the strongest looked at the stars and saw a map to the future they could take for themselves. Broke their backs making themselves canoes to cut through 40-foot swells and sails big enough to make a fist out of the wind, and then they got free from their old land. Goodbye old kings, goodbye old gods, goodbye old laws, goodbye old power, goodbye limits. Came a time in all their salty tattoo muscle nights on the water when they seen the white light of the moon over the new land of Hawaii, and they was like, this is ours. All us, all now. That's me the first night in Spokane. For real, I felt like all the kings that came before me, they was there in a heavy way, like they was right inside my heart, like they was chanting through my blood. I could see them with me, even if my eyes didn't close. We were the same, me and them. I went launching across the big gap of sky between Hawaii and the mainland, seeing the big grids of mainland city lights from the plane window, skyscrapers and highways that just kept going and going, all gold and white. For me, there was just like those navigating stars for the original Hawaiians, pointing the direction of what's mine. When I stepped off the night shuttle to Spokane and stood in front of the clean lawns and new brick buildings and saw the coaching staff ready to greet me as one of the top freshman basketball recruits in the whole country, I was like, all me, all now, king me. Before, back in Hawaii, all everyone wanted to do was for me to believe in Noah, to raise him up. Like my job was to be his keeper, to be second place, and to help him get to the finish line. I hate to break it to you, but I don't fit in second place. And for what? It's not like Noah ever got us nothing to show for it. Mom and Dad's still hurting for money at the end of the month. Same thing all over the islands. Only way you get out of something like that is to be so good, the only thing anyone can do is pay you, and pay you big. That's what I knew I was finally going to do when I got to Spokane. This started in fall 2004. Only thing that mattered was basketball. Captains ran the off-season work, and so we was in all the arenas, upstairs where the track is, wall squats and wind sprints, then back to the weight room. Guys was asking if I'd ever seen a place like this, rows and rows of clean bleachers for thousands of fans, the weight room facilities with top-end machines and new paint on the racks, and I was like, just because I'm from the islands, you think I never seen nothing like this? But then it was true too, not because of the islands, but because of Lincoln High. I only seen facilities this way when we was playing away games at Kahena or the other rich-ass prep schools. So yeah, I seen a place like this, but never before was it mine. All the halls and laboratories and commons, like they got fresh paint every other year, pretty little bookshop with all its way too high prices. But everywhere I swear, except in the locker room, the university was white as milk. I saw brown people on the sidewalk and I was like, thank God. I was starting to think I was the last one left. And the classes didn't even know what I signed up for. Serious. Someone from the front office of the team took care of registration and the homework I got help on. Guys on the team tipped me off to finding a tutor first week. Sophomore girl, if I can help it. Big eyes, toothpick jeans, cross around her neck like that. She'll help you out, they said. She'll know who we are. And it was just like they said. I had to write down the numbers and words myself, sure, but if my brain was there, it was on the scoop of her elbow, the freckles across her nose. Gotta love college. But basketball, we went hard. Every day, all the time. 15 of us on the grind, 10 times harder than I ever did back home. Just balling all the time, the tamp of the basketball into that polished wood, the perfect chirp of our shoes. We ran one-on-ones, we ran two-on-twos, we ran two-on-ones. Contested mid-range jumpers and turnarounds and arc shooting drills. This is a whole new level though. Guys on the team was all way quicker and stronger and smarter than anyone I ever played against back at Lincoln. Now I'm playing men instead of kids, and for that first year I felt it. They all had a step and an inch more in the air than me. Half my stuff was getting blocked or picked, and it was almost like the atmosphere around me would sink and get soft. Be bigger, be stronger and faster. I had to. I'll stop there. So, it's always weird stepping back out of the voice. I feel like such a
That was great. Thank you so much. If I remember correctly, you played baseball, right?
No, I played soccer. Oh no, now I'm gonna out myself. I love basketball. So I love basketball. I'm a huge basketball fan. I never played it. I probably should have picked it up when I was younger. I had the right build for it. I'm sure I would have been iced. I'm 6 feet, so it would have ended after high school, but I could have maybe made it through high school. I don't know. I played soccer. I played a ton of soccer. And I played a little bit of baseball, but I was terrible at it. And
How did Dean, I mean, I'm also a huge, so Dean ended up playing a basketball because it was a sport that you were a fan of watching?
yeah, it's just a beautiful sport, and I think there's
I love
not a lot of really good. There are, I take it back. There are plenty of good basketball books out there, but I love basketball, and it was one of the sports that I would have loved to see more of in writing and reading, you know. And I also, yeah, I just wanted to elevate a sport that I love that I think sometimes doesn't get as much airplay as it does. So.
I'm also a huge basketball fan, and it was, I mean, Noah, from the early part of the book, you would think like, yes, Noah's a star, but like one of the things that's great about the structure and space of the book is that it makes space for everyone in the book to be a star, and Dean does hold his own space. And you and I were talking a little bit before about gender and family roles and power, and of course, Kaui is also a star. And I was fascinated by how the dynamics between the children play out in relation to gender, both when they're very little and when they're older. There are these like occasionally these great descriptions of how they're sort of horsing around and it's gentle and loving, and then the transition into the part where they hurt each other. And I was like, oh, as a person with a sibling, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. And early on in the book, Noah says that he and Dean don't agree on much, but they agree that no one can hurt Kaui but them. And he doesn't say that to Kaui, who has her own strong personality. How did your thoughts about gender shape Kaui's arc and also Malia's choices?
Yeah. So Kaui, I think we were probably going to ask this at some point, or maybe not. This gets asked a lot, like who my favorite character was, and Kaui was definitely my favorite character. And part of the reason for that is because I love books in which, in particular, and this is so much more common than it was, 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago, whatever. But I love characters with female protagonists or female characters that push against a lot of the still, unfortunately, commonly held gender role stereotypes that are out there. And so I really wanted Kaui to have the space to be that sort of a character, and also to kind of explore the dynamics that exist within siblings, I think across genders, like regardless, especially when you're younger. And one of the things that I is a really interesting thing, and I don't think comes up too much in this book directly, but was part of how I was writing Kaui and how she kind of developed over time, is there's this time when you're younger that there's still a somewhat, there's like an androgyny about being a child up to a certain age, where you're just a kid, and you largely just own your body, and everybody gets into scraps and fights and wrestles around and things like that. But then there's this transition that happens for girls where all of a sudden they realize that they're their body represents something different all of a sudden, and the ownership of their body becomes this contested thing, and all of a sudden they realize like, oh, people are going to look at my body and think they have ownership of it, and there's all these new rules about how and when I get to use my body. And so things like wrestling with your brothers or punching each other all of a sudden become something that's very different than it was when you were younger. And so I wanted to explore that through Kaui, and also that other side of things, right? Because I wanted both Dean and Noah to have these somewhat traditional ideas, because again, the book starts in like the 90s or whatever. And so they're going to have pretty, what we would consider today, dated ideas of gender. And I didn't want them to like get out of it. Like I didn't want Nainoa or Dean, or especially Nainoa, I think it was very easy to set him up as a very angelic character. And so these were opportunities for him to have these backwards opinions, right? And to be somebody that still has some level of misogyny and these ideas of like traditional gender roles. And the way those would play out in my mind in a family would be those sorts of things, where it's essentially like, we have a certain level of ownership of Kaui's body that nobody else gets access to because we're family, right? And then that's obviously not true at all. And Kaui very much understands that and pushes back against that. But of course, then I know on Dean, it was one of those things where I thought it was an interesting way to explore and express that dynamic of ownership and the struggle for that in a person's body, in a person's very own body, like a woman's very own body. And it's the kind of thing that I've just observed and seen around me, and it was one of the things I wanted to explore in this book. I mean, I consider myself a feminist, and so while I don't want to write things that are straightforward, moralistic, diatribes or things like that, I also wanted to make sure I was pushing against those boundaries and exploring them in interesting ways. And I think you do this as well in Brotherless Night. One of the things I thought was really powerful for me reading that, since I've just obviously shown what my biases are, the things that interest me, is the characters struggle with that as well. I don't know if you want to talk briefly about your considerations of gender dynamics within the family and in the larger society in which these characters are in Sri Lanka in the middle of the Civil War. But I'd love to hear your perspective as well.
Sure. So for our listeners, Brotherless Night is set sort of in the first decade of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and it's from the perspective of a young girl who is part of the Tamil minority community, and she's growing up in kind of a majority Tamil town in northern Sri Lanka, and she wants to be a doctor, and she has 4 brothers, and she's the only sister. And there's lots of patriarchy around her in subtle ways and less subtle ways, even from men who care about her very much. She's actually very close to her brothers. And so I think, I guess I did feel a little bit like depictions of South Asian patriarchy are plentiful and often, especially in sort of like very, very mainstream depictions, they can be quite stereotypical, kind of like an I'm going to arrange your marriage kind of patriarchy. And I was interested in subtler ways that might play out, and even how it could look very tender and could manifest even in a like a kind of paternalistic care that would come out of love, and even if it were misguided, was coming out of a kind of misdirected affection. So people who kind of think that they have a hand in her fate, that they can direct where she's going, and she in the end doesn't really yield to that. She ends up doing a lot of things that I think people think she shouldn't do. Also a feminist novel. So it's also a lot of fun to write those brothers. I think that sibling relationships don't get as much space in fiction as we see a lot of very powerful stories about romantic love or about parents for children, generational epics, etc. And I don't know, your siblings are the people who are maybe very likely to be there from the beginning to the end. I mean, obviously not always, but they're, I don't know. So when you think about the passage of time, like the relationships that might change the most are actually those, which was part of why, I mean, it was so interesting. I'm weaving in here, I want to say, questions that the audience sent in advance, but also if you have questions, you could put them in the chat. And I could also weave them in that way. But so like, I really love my book is in retrospective, past tense, which just means it's sort of like, and when I was a child and like, could I have done these things differently? It's like sort of steeped in a kind of past tense that's heavy on like the distance of time and regret and all of that. And your book handles time so differently, because not only those multiple perspectives, but also, like, right, as those who are here know, like, each of these sections has right, it says whose point of view it's from, and then it says the year, and it's in past tense. But actually, to me, it has a feeling that I often associate with present tense, like a kind of energy and liveliness that is often like an energy and speed almost, like a real, yeah, a real life that I often associate with present tense. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you handle time in your storytelling, which was a question an audience member also sent in advance, and I was like, let's definitely ask that.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for that question. It's a really awesome one, and the way that you described you're the first person that has asked a question of that sort, which I think is so much fun, because I remember now when I was writing this, wanting that feeling to be there. And it's almost like I thought of it as if they were telling somebody the story really soon after it happened. So each of these characters, like when they're, and so I tried to match in some subtle ways, because man, I could only do so much of this at the same time. But like when they're in the different time periods, I also tried to age their voices appropriately. So when they're a little bit younger, their voices, I felt like, were younger voices. So I didn't want people to think of, oh, this is them when they're 40, telling this story from the start and looking all the way back to 1994. This is them like a day later talking to one of their friends, more or less. And like, that's kind of where I wanted to ground their psyche, is it's like, this is a very close to the time of the event past tense. So it's like a couple hours later, you're remembering this thing, or you're talking to somebody else, or you're talking to yourself in your head, and the thing just happened. And so that was the form of past tense that I was working with, and that was the way that I had approached it. And it is otherwise very, very linear in its time. You know, time just moves linearly through the book, and doesn't circle back too much or have any sort of major flashbacks or things like that, which I think if I had done that, it would have been even harder to write. But yeah, I did try to think of the tense as like a near term past tense, which, yeah, I don't know. It just seemed appropriate. It just seemed like the way to tell the story. I don't know.
It works beautifully. I mean, I think it had all of my favorite things about present tense and all of my favorite things about past tense. And the voices do, I mean, as you say, like they feel of the moment or of that age, which must have been an enormous amount of work. I mean, you know, for me, so much of writing involves sitting around muttering to myself. You were muttering to yourself in so many voices and so many ages.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really hard. I think I wrote through the different sections. I think the way that I ended up tackling it is I just really had to, after I got through the first, I think 2 drafts or something, and things had settled in structurally and the major plot points were in place, then I had to do each section, I believe, start to finish, just working through that character. I had a really hard time if I was like working on Nainoa's parts of the novel to then switch to another voice. I think at one point I was like, I just have to go through their whole arc with each voice and try and get the voice consistent, and also pay attention to them kind of aging and how their voice might change as a result of age. So I think one of the drafts, that ended up being like the way that I had to tackle that draft. Again, that was part of why it took 10 years, because I was doing all this stuff, and then it was like, I don't know, like my wife is giving birth, like she wouldn't labor in the middle of some of the revisions. I remember being like typing at like 5 in the morning, and I could hear my wife Christina. I was like, oh, her breathing has changed. She's like, oh, she's awake, because we were living in like a little studio apartment at the time, and I was like, oh no, I know what's going on. And so I like got it from the keyboard and ran in there, and I was like, is this it? I was like, is this baby coming? And she's like, yep. And she's like, yeah, and by the way, this has been happening for 2 hours, thanks, you know. So anyway, that's total aside. But
no, I mean, you know, the intensity of revisions, it seems
right.
very very on topic to me. So you're talking about having those plot beats in there. I mean, it's a very voice driven book. It's also super plotty. I at the U sometimes have taught a class about plot as revision, and sort of like the notion that, you know, like a big thing you can do when you're revising is change what happens. But that sometimes is really tough work. So were there particular plot points that were hard for you to nail down, or moments when you were like, I'm not totally sure what happens to Noah? I don't know whether Dean makes this choice or not, or like.
Yeah. So the big thing that happens with Nainoa, you know, the point at which, man, I might as well just spoil it. I keep this to myself for most of the discussions, but I think at this point everybody should have mostly read through it. So if you haven't, here's a spoiler alert. I guess you can close your ears. But Nainoa dies, right? And there were versions of this that I wrote where he didn't. where I tried to play with it a little bit and see which route to take, because it felt like a very drastic thing to do. And I ultimately went the route of having what happens to him happen. And that was one of the major plot points that I had kind of in the air early, had some questions about, where Dean ends up in jail and the things that happened to him. Parts of it I questioned whether they were too dramatic. I was like, is this like overly dramatic? Am I turning this into some, is this melodramatic? And is there a way to kind of see these things happening in a less dramatic light? But I also, as a reader, find myself, I like voice is really important. And I think I can read a book that has like a really distinct voice that could be somewhat less loose in terms of a plot. Like maybe it's mostly in a book that deals with the interior and has a lot of flashbacks and things like that. Tinkers by Paul Harding is one of my favorite books.
Gorgeous.
And that's a book where it's like, if you tried to map the plot or follow the plot, like I don't even bother. I feel like it ruins the magic of the book. If you just read through it and let yourself be absorbed by all these things that happen, it's beautiful. And it's not one where I think you read it for the plot. You read it for that voice and this like incredible like consciousness that you're dropped into. And one of the characters is dealing with I'm so bad in these things. I always forget important words to remember. He's dealing with a mental illness, like a brain chemistry issue. There's a very clear word for it. People get it all the time. Anyway, I can't remember it right now.
It's not in my brain.
But so we get to experience these moments of his brain like breaking down. They're just fantastic. It's amazing. But that's a book that is entirely driven by the voice and this like incredible consciousness. But from a plot perspective, it's like, I don't want to say train wreck, but it's like very hard to follow from a plot perspective. But then there's other books that I love that it's very much a plot type of book. Like, one of the books that I love and continually go back to is the Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, because I remember it from when I was younger and read it. It had a huge impression on me. And that one I would say is, it's very plot, like the plot points and these important things that happen are in that book as well. So it can go either way, but like a plot, that's what keeps a lot of people around. You get those exciting plot points and it keeps people invested, So.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does make sense to me that, I was sort of like, I'll let you decide if we're having the spoiler or not. But yeah, to make that big decision to go back and forth, like to know that there's a version of the book that exists where that doesn't happen. And then all of the kind of math, like, right, if you push one domino over, then like all of these other decisions fall behind it. And if you revise, you got to go back and pull them all back up and like maybe push them in a different direction. I'm probably revealing myself as a person who doesn't really play with dominoes, but I think that it's just, I actually think this is one of the hugely fun things about revision, but it's also the most work. And then once you commit, you're like, oh my God, he dies.
Yeah. Yeah, that was just a really hard one for me. I really went back and forth on that, but I think, I think it just considering mortality and having that be a part of things and the reality of it. If you've ever experienced having that happen with people or care about, or the kind of that illusion that there's some permanency or some guaranteed, like, I don't know, if you're like a good person or if you are an important person in like your family or something, this idea that you might not be there the next day for some arbitrary reason, like getting in a car accident or something like that. Those things happen, right? And so I think that trying to grapple with them in fiction is important, because otherwise we end up with I think that we settle in as readers and just viewers of general stories often to the idea that the main characters kind of find their way through these difficult situations and they're there in the end. Except for, obviously in your book, when you're dealing with something like war, I think everybody understands the realities of that and how it can just yank people's lives out from under them in really awful, violent ways. But when we think of people's lives on a day-to-day basis, we generally don't think of people as having these precariousness in our lives. But, like getting in a car and driving is one of the most dangerous things you can do. And so I played with that a bit, trying to figure out where that would fit in. And I think that it was an important part of this book to have, because it inverted the narrative in a way I thought was really interesting, that it wouldn't have otherwise. I found the way that things went if Nainoa kind of stayed around was much different than once he was gone. And I think that's where that whole savior idea kind of gets thrown up in the air. And there's this question of, well, we had so much writing on this narrative of a single person being like the path forward, being our path to salvation. And the reason that I wanted to play with that is because for me, that represents the larger this larger myth of that I have encountered in my own life, and the way that I have seen so much of history rendered in the United States, for instance, in particular, United States history is so often is collapsed into these narratives of largely big male figures, where it's like, I don't know, like the civil rights movement ended because Martin Luther King Jr. gave these speeches and things like that. And you're like, there were all these people working in the communities, and a lot of them were Black women of color that were doing work behind the scenes that made this possible. And even when people talk about Rosa Parks, you're like, you understand that wasn't just a thing that happened this one day where she decided for that to happen. She was a trained person working very decisively in civil disobedience, and all these other characters you can mention that were part of that struggle that get lost in the discussion. And it gets narrowed for a lot of people in the United States to this like big man theory of history, where there's like, there was a big moment where a man rose up and saved us all from this problem. And so one of the things that I thought was an interesting way to interrogate that through this novel was having what happened to Nainoa happen. And then the family is left with that. Everybody's left with this like, oh, wait, so this story we've been telling ourselves about who we are as a family and what he represented is totally like, that's gone. And so what does that mean for us now? Right. And so I think the answers they all find are much more interesting and ask us a lot more questions about what that means for our country, or ideas about how history happens and how change happens, at important times in our lives. So
I love the way that book resists sort of individualistic notions of narrative and heroism. And Amy has a question, which I'm going to fold into my last one. So that we've been talking about kind of history, the legacy of colonialism, and kind of the ways that these characters struggle with society systems and structures, but they are also, of course, making powerful choices. And I'm curious about how you thought about depicting history's influence on inequality and poverty, et cetera, and balancing that with writing characters who seek power in an unequal present. And Amy's question, which I think kind of folds into this, is, who would you say is the savior in the book?
Yeah. So that one of the things that I loved about it is that, putting that there in the title and having it be something that's obvious as a theme, but leaving it largely unresolved leaves room for different people to have different ideas about that. And I think that ultimately, the answer that I would give was, there was a sense of the places where I think the most healing and transformation and power was built to change things was an interrelatedness between people, right? Like building connections and relationships. And so I would say, strong relationships of love, without it being too like, I don't want to turn it into a trite answer, like love is the savior, but being in these strong relationships, and once you're bonded to other people and wanting to make those relationships into ones that spread wider and wider, which I think is a lot of what we see with Kaui as she gets to the tail end of the book, to me represent kind of an answer to that, which is, again, going back to that issue of, we have like this big man theory of history, but the reality is there are so many unsung people doing the work on a daily basis. So many of them are women. We're building these strong relationships that end up carrying groups forward. And so for me, that saviorship is kind of the building of strong relationships among people, is what allows you to kind of persevere and improve things and hold each other up when the other person stumbles and things like that. But I also, just at a larger level, I think there's people like my wife, for instance, I think read this book and it's like, this book's kind of a downer, and I was like, I don't know what to tell you, except that these are things I struggle with, that it's like, a lot of the things that end up in these novels are things where if I brought them up at like a cocktail party, people would be like, there's something wrong with that dude. And so that if I try and grapple with them in my fiction and things like that, it feels a little bit less alienating, because for me, it's so obvious that there are so many like troubling indications of like the failures of the social contract of the United States of America, and those play out in really painful ways. And to have that be happening in a place like Hawaii, that a lot of people associate with this idea of like an island paradise, and they cast all these like, paradise images upon it, and it's seen as a place for like a packaged vacation destination for you to come and enjoy and then leave. And yet at the same time, because of the history of colonialism, a sovereign nation that used to be, in many ways, it's not a perfect place. I don't want to leave people with the idea that the ancient kingdom of Hawaii was like a perfect place, but they had a lot of things figured out that we have since lost touch with, that we need to return to. And so I wanted to kind of address some of those things and ask the questions of like, how does that fit in with this like post-colonial modern capitalist society, and that alongside these ideas of the big man theory of history, like how do all those things play out in this space? And so, that was part of what drove, questions of what happens to the family and sort of like where they fit in with things. I don't know if I answered that question though.
No, I think what you're saying, of course, just reminds me of, every time I go to Hawaii, it feels to me that it's one of the places in the world that feels to me like Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
In both the best ways and in the most concerning ways. So yeah, and that tension is always part of how I feel in that physical space. I wonder if I know we're at the top of the hour, but there is this great passage, and I wonder if you want to read a little bit from the Aliyah 2008 section that just sort of talks a little bit about themes of history.
Yeah, which pages are those on? Okay, here it is. Yeah, here it is. So this is page 180 in the paperback. It's Malia 2008. And I know, Elaine, we're almost done here. I'll try to read just a short part of it. So this is Malia. So she's the father or the mother in the family, right? And so this is just one of the parts where she's observing her thoughts about the islands. If a God is a thing that has absolute power over us, then in this world there are many. There are gods that we choose and gods that we can't avoid. There are gods that we pray to and gods that prey on us. There are dreams that become gods and pasts that become gods and nightmares that do as well. As I age, I learn that there are more gods than I'll ever know, and yet I have to watch for all of them, or else they can use me or I can lose them without even realizing it. Take money. My grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, Kanakamawali that she was, had no use for paper printed with a silhouette of some faraway haole man. It gave nothing. What was needed was food from the earth, housing from the earth, medicine from the earth, a sense of one's place in the system. What was provided and what had to be cultivated. But ships from far ports carried a new god in their bellies, a god who blew a breath of weeping blisters and fevers that torched whole generations, a god whose fingers were shaped like rifles and whose voice sounded like treaties waiting to be broken. And money was the name of that god, and it was the sort of god that preyed on you, made demands, and laid its hands on you with such force as to make the Old Testament piss its pants. We were made eventually to pray to it, whether we wanted to or not. Your father and I still pray to it now. Take language. Olelo Hawaii, which was not written, only passed from one mouth to the next, less letters than the English that soon roared over it, and yet it contained more mana of Hawaii than anything that foreign tongue could twist itself into. What do you do when pono, a healing word, a power word, a word that is emotions and relationships and objects in the past and the present and the future, 1,000 prayers all at once, worth 83 of the words from the English, righteousness, morality, prosperity, excellence, assets, carefulness, resources, fortune, necessity, hope, and on, is outlawed. When our language, Olelo Hawaii, was outlawed, so our gods went, so prayers went, so ideas went, so the islands went. Take you, my son. You are not a god, but there is something that moves through you that may be one. Does it revive what came before or build something new? I can't say. I'll leave it there. I can see Elaine looking at me. It's like the parents came home, the party's breaking up.
Thank you so much, Kabai and Sugi. We're so appreciative of the conversation and the readings this evening. As a part of the One Book program, the ebook and audiobook of Sharks in the Time of Saviors are available for free download through Sunday, September 22nd on eBooks Minnesota, and you can still visit thefriends.org/onebook for that link and additional resources. I'd like to thank our partners, Council of Regional Public Library Systems Administrators, Mac and Via, Macmillan Publishers, Minitex, the Minnesota Department of Education, Recorded Books, and the State Library Services. This program is made possible in part by the state of Minnesota through an appropriation to the Minnesota Department of Education. We want to hear what this program has meant to you, so be on the lookout for a brief questionnaire, and we'll send a link to the recording of today's event. I am leaving this program with greater appreciation for the thoughtful readers and amazing writers in our state, and especially our two guests. Thank you again to everyone for being part of One Book, One Minnesota, and good night.